Hey there, fellow travelers. Welcome to the Tolkien Road, episode 351. In this episode, we're continuing our journey through the fall of Númenor by exploring the end of the War of the Three Rings. Before we get started, I'd like to give a double up air five to our amazing fellowship. 3, 2, 1, whoopsht. Boom. Special thanks to this episode's executive producers, John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, Jacob Lockham, John H., Melkor27, and KG. Also, a shout out to those celebrating their fellowship anniversary in September or October of 2023: Catherine, Tom S., Cherie R., Stephanie B., John W., Alan C., Dustin Q., Robert S., Melkor27, Eugene D., James L., Ken P., Samuel B., Redhawk, and Alex S. Thank you all so much for sticking with us over the years. Join the Fellowship of the Road by visiting patreon.com/TolkienRoad. When you join the Fellowship of the Road, it helps us to keep on evering on and lend you some cool perks along the way. Learn more at patreon.com/TolkienRoad. If you're watching, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and let us know what's on your mind in the comments below. Finally, attention binge listeners. Subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes or the platform of your choice. If you are a 5-star fan of the Tolkien Road, you can really help us out by heading over to iTunes or your preferred source for the show and dropping us a rating and review. When you do that, it helps get the word out about the Tolkien Road, which helps us to keep on evering on. All right. With Sauron's invading armies having been pushed back from the River Lune and subsequently routed at the Battle of Tharbad, the Dark Lord is on the run. In this episode, we're looking at the next series of events, those of the year Second Age 1701. The original source for this chapter is primarily Unfinished Tales. All right, well, let's kick things off as we are accustomed to doing in this series on the fall of Númenor by acknowledging who is currently the ruler of Númenor. It is still Tar Telperion, who has been the ruler of Númenor for the last several episodes. She is the second ruling queen of Númenor, and she will reign until Second Age 1731. So she's got about 30 years left in her reign at this point, and that is where we are in the history of Númenor's rulers right now. Of course, we had Minastir make an appearance in last episode as the leader of the Númenorian forces that came to the aid of Eriador. So. And Minastir, as we'll learn, will become the king after Tar Telperion. So a little more on that towards the end of the episode. All right, well, let's turn things over to our map because it's going to be very important here as we discuss what happens in this chapter. Okay, well, as you might remember, where we stood last time, there was Sauron's forces where is my? There we go. Sauron's forces at the beginning of this war had come up. They had attacked Eregion and kind of defeated Eregion, and then there had been a further force that had kind of followed up and chased the elves back to Imladris, but then the main force of Sauron had come through Tharbad up towards the River Lune, and the goal was to attack the Grey Havens and to take and to really destroy the kingdom of Lindan, the elvish kingdom of Lindan up there. So that's really where we left off. We had these two main fronts of Sauron's war. This, of course, was the larger one. This was the slightly smaller one, and that's where things stood. And then there was a fleet of Númenorians that attacked here and attacked here at the Grey Flood, and Sauron's force was pushed back to Tharbad, really pushed back here as well, and then they're really the pincher move is put on them, right? The Númenorian forces put this pincher on Sauron's forces at Tharbad and pretty much destroy what remains of Sauron's army right here at Tharbad. And that's where we left off. So in 1701, with having been defeated utterly at Tharbad, Sauron flees back to this region, which at this time is called Kalinarthon, right? Kalinarthon. It becomes Rohan later on, and he is assailed again in Kalinarthon, and then has to further flee back all the way to Dagorlad, and eventually, of course, he'll wind up back in Mordor in his stronghold. Eriador is cleared of the enemy, and Sauron's forces, not only the force that was assailing Lindon is destroyed, but also the force that was assailing Imladris itself is destroyed. So, what looked like might be certain victory for Sauron just a year before is now utter defeat. Now, he is allowed, this isn't, I guess you would say, complete surrender, because he's allowed to kind of go back into his stronghold of Mordor and maybe, ruminate there. They don't invade Mordor at this time to put a stop to it. They kind of leave him be over here, assuming that he doesn't have any way to, attack them at this point. So that's the state. That's the end of the War of the Three Rings. And it's interesting to me as I think through all this, how the ebb and flow of it reminds me a lot of like World War II. I think of how, especially in the European theater, but I think you can make the same case for the Pacific theater. You have an aggressor with the European theater and the Nazis who attack these different fronts. Things look really bad, like the good guys are gonna be defeated, and then there's another force that comes in and really really kind of saves the day. Now, I won't sit here and tell you exactly how that aligns, but it's more of the sense of like it looks very dire for the people who ultimately win, right? At one point in the war, it looks very dire for the allies that ultimately win. Just like in World War II, it was the same kind of case, right? The Nazis were on the doorstep of Moscow. They had encircled Leningrad. It looked like they were going to push through Stalingrad and then just kind of have, be able to encircle Moscow and eventually just take over the entirety of Russia all the way up to the Ural Mountains. But they were defeated at Stalingrad, pushed back, and eventually pushed back completely out. And then, of course, the Allies, the Western Allies, and the Americans and the British invade Normandy in 1944, and the pincher move is ultimately put on the Nazis, and they're just utterly destroyed and have to completely surrender at the end of World War II. So, it's interesting to me how this just kind of reflects that. Just offhanded comment, I would say, of course, Tolkien having lived through World War II and, having probably stayed attuned to what was going on during the war and maybe even read a little bit about it afterwards. Interesting note in my mind. We learn next that a White Council was held, the first White Council, in fact, at the end of the war. And it's held in Imladris, as we learn later on. But, the thing that stuck out to me when I read this was, well, who was there? Because I know that in the Third Age, late in the Third Age, Saruman and Gandalf are both part of the White Council, but neither of them are in Middle-earth at this time. So who was there? Well, I mean, I guess essentially that leaves us with the Elvish participants. Is it possible, perhaps, that there were Númenorians there? I think it's possible. I wouldn't be too surprised by that. We don't get any record of exactly who it might have been, though, but we might at least guess that Galadriel, Elrond, Círdan, and Gil-galad were all there. So those are the four that I think we can be pretty sure were a part of this. And probably other Eldar as well. But ultimately we'll never, of course we'll never know exactly who Tolkien might have had in mind with that. he only left us that small detail with regard to this first White Council. But more important is what is decided at the White Council. So first off, the elves decide that they're not going to even bother with rebuilding Eregion. Eregion, of course, was the first elvish city that was lost during the War of the Three Rings. It was the place where the Three Rings were made. Celebrimbor is killed at the Battle of Eregion, and they decide, you know what, we're just going to leave Eregion to overgrow. It's done for. We're not going to bother with rebuilding it. Instead, we're going to to build up Imladris right here, Rivendell. So the decision is made to kind of put their resources in restoring, and whatever resources they might have used towards restoring Eriador, put that back towards restoring to building up Imladris, which is pretty new at this point. Also, Gil-galad gives Vilya the blue ring to Elrond. Of course, Gil-galad at this point had the blue ring and the red ring. Galadriel has the white ring. Gil-galad gives the blue ring to Elrond, and Elrond becomes the vice regent of Eriador under Gil-galad. And then Gil-galad keeps the red ring, Narya, and he eventually gives that to Círdan, and then eventually later, Círdan gives that to Gandalf. So the red ring passes through some different parties eventually. And then it says the Westlands, this region, really, I guess we could say west of the Anduin. This region west of the Anduin had peace for many years, and we'll find that is a very long time of peace that they in fact have before Sauron attempts anything like he did during the War of the Three Rings. All right. Well, the next thing we learn about was Galadriel's sea longing. What was this? I kind of was wondering, what is the significance when we hear about the sea longing of the elves? And, I got me wondering, one of the things we know about, especially the Noldor, those who had been in the Blessed Realm before and left, and before the First Age, at the Darkening of Valinor, when they left, there was this sense that, that they had done so in kind of a rebellion, and they were called back at the end of the First Age to the Blessed Realm, but many of them chose not to go. And, I think that's a much more significant fact than many of us, than we maybe spend time thinking about. But it got me thinking, like, was this just like a summons, like, come on back, we order you to come back? Or was there something deeper going on? And when I hear about the sea longing in Galadriel, it makes me think that sometimes we sense things about, deeper responsibilities we have, and they manifest as longings within us, right? Or deeper calls that we have, and they manifest as longings in us, not necessarily as someone being like, hey, you should do this, but as a sense of like, I belong here, I'm not happy anywhere else. These sorts of issues. So I thought that was a really interesting concept, and I wanted to, I think to illustrate this a little more, of course, it just kind of mentions this in passing here, this sea longing, but I wanted to read a little bit of her song from Fellowship of the Ring, because I think we see that sea longing in this song, and this is in the chapter Farewell to Lorien. I sang of leaves of gold, and leaves of gold there grew. Of wind I sang, a wind there came, and in the branches blew. Beyond the sun, beyond the moon, the foam was on the sea, and by the strand of Ilmarin there grew a golden tree. Beneath the stars of Evereve and Eldamar it shone, and Eldamar beside the walls of elven Tirion. There long the golden leaves have grown upon the branching years, while here beyond the sundering seas now fall the elven tears. O Lorien, the wind comes, the bare and leafless day. The leaves are falling in the stream, the river flows away. O Lorien, too long I have dwelt upon the hither shore, and in a fading crown have twined the golden Eleanor. And if of ships I now should sing, what ship would come to me? What ship would bear me ever back across so wide a sea? Just a beautiful, beautiful poem there, and I think that really captures Galadriel's sea longing. It's a longing not simply for the sea, and maybe at this later time when she sang that song at the end of the Third Age, thousands of years later, she had discerned more that was what was pulling her towards the sea. It wasn't the sea itself, but it was what lay beyond the sea to the west, right? The blessed realm where she had once lived in this paradise on earth. So this sea longing is really a deep part of her, and so she leaves Lorinand with Celebrian, her daughter, and she travels through Moria and finds Celeborn in Imladris. And so this is why she's in Imladris when the White Council happens, because she goes through Moria with Celebrian and finds Celeborn there. We get a note, interestingly, that Elrond loves Celebrian, but he says nothing of it, right? He meets Celebrian for the first time, and he says nothing of it. So this is, this foreshadows, of course, their romance and their eventual marriage, a long time later in the history of Middle-earth. But Galadriel and Celeborn and Celebrian eventually leave Imladris and go to dwell in Belfalas at Dol Amroth. So I wanted to look at this because how this reads is kind of strange to me. I'll read the passage in question. We have. Give me one moment here. Okay, there we go. It says, "It was while Galadriel was in Imladris that the council referred to above was held, but at some later time, there is no indication of the date, Galadriel and Celeborn, together with Celebrian, departed from Imladris and went to the little inhabited lands between the mouth of the Gwathlo and Ether Anduin." Excuse me. So I was just interested to say, okay, whereabouts was this? And you read, we're pretty familiar with the location of the Gwathlo at this point because it is the the river in the last episode where the Númenorian, the southern Númenorian forces put ashore and kind of surprised the forces at Tharbad, Sauron's forces at Tharbad. So, here is, you can see on my map here. Well, let's try that again. Apparently, it's not showing up. Not sure what's going on there. Let's try it again. Well, oh, I'm doing the wrong one. There we go. Okay, here's the right map. So it shows on the Gwathlo, the Grey Flood, here, really in kind of the southern portion of Eriador. But if you look at this portion of the southern portion that bans this area where supposedly Galadriel and Celeborn and Celebrian head to, it's the Ether Anduin. So that's actually way down here. That's actually way down here. In like the where it says South Gondor. That is a massive, massive area to say they're like kind of wondering about it. I mean, we've got roughly 450 miles with this little bar right here. This is almost, I mean, I would say it's over 1,000 miles from the Gwathlo to the Ether Anduin. So it's just a funny little note that he kind of says, oh, they kind of got wandering somewhere about in this region. Well, they must have been wandering for a long time, and especially due to the fact that there are mountain ranges and that kind of thing that separate these two areas. So I just found that to be sort of an interesting note. But maybe more importantly, we find out that they come to dwell in what is later known as Dol Amroth and Belfalas. So that is this area right here. So much closer actually to Ether Anduin, which is the mouth of the Anduin, than to the Grey Flood. But perhaps what he meant, kind of what he means by this is they journeyed down towards the Grey Flood and eventually made their way here. So maybe it's because either they went around all the way to the tip here of Androst, or perhaps there was a pass in the mountains and the White Mountains over here that allowed them to cross over into Gondor and eventually get to Belfalas there. But yes, that's where Celeborn and Galadriel come to dwell for apparently a very long time. Many Nondoran elves from Lorinond come with them, or eventually come to where they are, and they dwell in Dol Amroth, and they dwell there for a very long time, for several thousand years, really, until later on in the Third Age they come back to Lothlorien. What is that at that time? Lothlorien. All right. So one other thing I wanted to talk about was the curious case of Amroth. So here, Amroth is the other child of Celeborn and Galadriel, and they leave him Galadriel leaves him in Lorinond to be the ruler when she leaves, and so he stays there for a long time and is the ruler, and then the story is they kind of eventually come back to that area once once it's kind of fallen into disrepair after his death. But in later versions of the Legendarium, actually, it's revised that Amroth is the son of Amdir, a Sindarin elf. And in both these stories, he serves as the ruler of Lorinond, Lothlorien, for a long period of time. He's the same Amroth that is commemorated by Legolas in the Song of Nimrodel in Lord of the Rings. So you may remember this song as being in the chapter Lothlorien. At one point, Legolas, being in that region, is reminded of the Song of Nimrodel, and it's the Song of Nimrodel is basically this kind of legend at that point of these two figures, Amroth and Nimrodel, who developed this romance, and they were real figures, but it's an old story by the time Legolas is singing this song. So I'm not sure we'll ever know how Tolkien would have ultimately handled the figure of Amroth if he had told a more complete version of the history of the Second Age. But in either case, it does seem that Amroth was the ruler of Lorinond and Lothlorien for a long time before Celeborn and Galadriel took up its rule. So that's my big takeaway. Whether he was the son of Celeborn and Galadriel or not, he was the ruler of Lorinond and Lothlorien for a long time until, before Galadriel and Celeborn came to be the Lady and Lord of Lothlorien. All right. Last note on this chapter: Tar Minister ascends in the year Second Age 1731. So he is born in 1474 and lives until 1873. So maybe a little bit on the shorter end of reign spans as far as recent rulers of Númenor go. His name means watchtower, and again, it's always funny to me how like their names reflect things they did later in their lives, but or perhaps things more absurd, certain later on. But because of course it wasn't like he built a watchtower before he was born, but he's named Watchtower, and guess what he does? He builds a tower on the hill of Oromet, nigh to Andunier. So let's look at where that is. Here's our map of Númenor, and Andunier, of course, is this kind of the holy city on the northwest coast of Númenor, where you can kind of see on a clear day, you can see the light from the Blessed Realm, or at least from the lonely island, Tol Eressëa. And he builds this tower on Oromet right here. So, kind of in this location right there. And it looks out to the west. He loved to gaze westward. That's the thing we know. And, of course, he was this, mighty, kind of mighty sea captain as well, who led the armies of Númenor, the fleet of Númenor to, attack, to help in the War of the Three Rings. We'll find out that he had a son as well who was very important in that role, who will be the king after him. We'll talk more about that figure later on. But the thing that stood out to me here was the yearning, right? So the yearning. He loved the Eldar but envied them. And, it's that seed of envy that I detect right here. He still loves and admires the Eldar. He appreciates them. He wants to look out upon that area, but now he envies them. And I have to wonder a little bit, is that because we have no indication of this, but I do wonder, does he does he envy them now because he's tasted of war, right? He has experienced the horrors of war, and he wishes he could go to a place that was blessed, right? He wishes he could depart from all of that shadow and and experience the the blessedness of the light of Aman. So, it's kind of reading between the lines a little bit, I guess, but I do wonder if that's where this seed of envy came from. And I think we are going to find out later on that it was during his reign that the first inklings of the shadow, really started to be felt in Númenor. And what does that mean exactly? Well, we'll talk about it, next time. As far as our sketch in this episode, or in this chapter, I will just say, I'm not really sure what this is. We have two figures in a wooded area and appear to be in a deep forest near a stream. And, I don't think it's Sauron fleeing or anything like that. My best guess is that we're talking about Galadriel and Celeborn, but it could be Elrond and Celebrian. It could be Galadriel and Celebrian. I'm not sure, but those are my best guesses as far as who we're dealing with in this image. Sort of a kind of a vague, haunting image. Beautiful, but vague and haunting to some degree. All right, so what are the key takeaways from this chapter? Well, first of all, Sauron loses the War of the Three Rings, and there's peace for a long time in the Westlands, in Eriador and the lands west of the Anduin. The other key takeaway is the Númenorians begin to grow in power and influence in Middle-earth here, like in a major way. And this will have major consequences for the story of Númenor going forward. So while, and I think this happens often in war, sometimes, the force that maybe, or the party that maybe has, and ends up gaining the most ground from a war can oftentimes find itself in a position to to make decisions thereafter that are going to lead to big problems for it kind of festering underneath. And I think that's what happens with Númenor here, and we're going to find out a lot more about that in the next chapter. All right, so next time we'll look at the consequences of the war for Númenor as well as the reign of Tar Kiriatan. All right. Well, let's look at a quick note of correspondence here. This is from G Mansard 641 on YouTube, sent in September 2023 in response to my video Tolkien versus the Nazis Part 2, Stalin, Apartheid, South Africa, Churchill, Soviets, Russia, and Mordor. So kind of a grab bag of topics I covered in that video. Cool video. You should go check it out. Here's what G Mansard 641 says. It is so good to see J.R.R. Tolkien receive so much acclaim. When I first read Lord of the Rings at 16, now 45 years ago, I was thoroughly captivated. It only intensified after I read The Silmarillion, which remains my favorite. I then reread Lord of the Rings and was astounded at the depth and details I did not notice the first time. A few years later, I went off to university and was appalled at the low regard in which the established academics held him. Kept my enthusiasm to myself, though I happily devoured every new book that Christopher Tolkien published over the ensuing years. I am now a professor myself, history, and I refer to J.R.R. quite often in reference to the Great War or when discussing comparative mythology or Beowulf or any time I manage to include something about the Kalevala. Well, thank you so much for your comment. It is interesting to me because I've heard similar comments over the years about how so many in academia, do not hold Tolkien in any kind of regard. I think it's probably changed some, in the last, few decades perhaps. But I definitely hear that, back at kind of the initial popularity of Lord of the Rings, the cultural phenomenon when it was first released, and maybe the couple of decades after, that people, maybe the highly educated, kind of turned up their noses at it because it wasn't what most of them thought was kind of like the vanguard, right? It wasn't like the avant-garde cultural kind of focus for many academic types at that time. It wasn't the cutting edge kind of thing. It felt like something from the old world, from the old way of doing things. It was too, maybe rife with tradition and that kind of thing. And I think, over time, the brilliance of Tolkien's works have, really spoken for themselves. The best works have a lasting, they tend to last. They tend to just stand the test of time. They tend to be things we keep coming back to. And that's what I take consolation in. I think Tolkien himself, I just get the sense that from his own life story that he often was on, the wrong side of academia in a lot of ways, and what may have been trendy or the popular notions at the time. You read on fairy stories, and you kind of get this sense. Even with something like Mythopoeia, at the end of Leaf by Niggle, when we're hearing from, kind of the powerful and the academics in that discussion, and that happens in the epilogue of Leaf by Niggle, you can kind of get this sense of like this kind of sneering attitude they have towards, these types have towards figures that Tolkien might have thought of himself as. So I don't think it's really any surprise that that academia in general has maybe had this kind of attitude towards Tolkien's works over time. But I do think it's maybe changing some. I think people are starting to realize that he did something truly brilliant, and people maybe hopefully care a little less about like what's in vogue right now than they used to. But I don't know. The more things change, the more they stay the same as well. But all I know is Tolkien is awesome, and I'd much rather read Tolkien than just about anything. And I think that's probably how a lot of people feel. And I was talking to just a friend randomly the other day, pretty well educated guy, and has worked in academia. And just offhand, he knew about my love for Tolkien, and he basically said, I had no idea how popular Tolkien was. Like, I had no idea that how many copies of Lord of the Rings had sold. And I was like, yeah, it's like the most popular book of the 20th century. It's crazy how many copies it sold and still sells. So I think just the popularity itself, people might look at the pop, and sometimes people look at popularity and they don't like popularity because it's popular. And I get it. I get it. Sometimes really bad stuff becomes popular, but that's not the case with Lord of the Rings. Anybody who says that, like, if that's somebody's contention, I might try to argue with them, but I'm probably just going to be like, okay, if that's what you think, I don't really have much to say to you. I'd kind of pity you for your perspective. Sometimes that's all you can do. But anyway, thank you for your comment, G-Man Start 641. Really appreciate you, and thank you for everybody. Thank you everybody who comments, and please keep that correspondence coming. We'll do our best to respond to you somehow and at some point. All right, don't forget to stop by TrueMythsPress.com for great merch like super styling and comfy Tolkien Road t-shirts, 2 Trees camper mugs, and signed copies of my books. Once again, that's TrueMythsPress.com. Thanks for supporting our work with your purchase. And thank you to our amazing patrons, especially the following: John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, Jacob Lockham, John H., Melkor27, KG, Emilio P, Jonathan D, Robert H, Paul D, Julia, Werty, JoeBagelMan, Richard K, Matt R, Matthew W, John W, Eugene D, Chris B, Daniel S, Seb M, Cory C, Carolyn S, Emiel K, Ms. Anonymous, Andrew T, Redhawk, Shannon S, Brian O, Zeke F, James L, Chris L, Asya V, Ish of the Hammer, Teresa C, David of Pints with Jack, Eric B, and Alaskan Moose 31. Thank you all so much. We truly appreciate our patrons, our amazing fellowship. And thank you to everybody for watching and or listening. We will talk at you next time. Bye-bye.